All right, so I hope everyone is having a good week. This is Thanksgiving week, and we are moving into the second part of our discussion of the book of Judges. So enjoy, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving this week. We're just going to explore more, once again, of that basic concept that we do not have history, we only have historians. So, what is it that are some other aspects that are being trying to be taught to us in the book of Judges? That is the question we're trying to answer today. So, in our second part of our discussion of the book of Judges, we want to try to deal with three things as always. So, the first thing is we're just going to talk about an overview of the judges, just kind of once again to give a broad view of those 12 judges and kind of the patterns that are there. And we're just going to spend a little more time sort of emphasizing that. Then we're going to talk about Gideon and the kingship that comes up in Gideon's narrative, and we'll kind of segue into that. And then we'll talk about the idea of leadership with Samson being the judge that we're going to start with because he is what is considered the worst of the judges, but still has an important leadership role in ancient Israel. All right, and so last time we talked about just the overview of the book of Judges. This time we're going to focus on the Judges cycle, and specifically we're just going to focus on the patterns that everything has in this section here of the Judges cycle. So we're going to zoom in on Othniel and how he fits the pattern for the cycle that's given to us before this section. And then we're going to focus on Gideon, Othniel being the first judge and Gideon being the fourth judge. And then we're going to go to the 12th, the last judge, Samson, and kind of discuss one aspect of his. So just keep that in mind, Othniel being the first, Gideon being the fourth, and Samson being the 12th judge. That'll be our focus for today. So one of the things that's important to understand about the overview of this section is that this section is being recorded much later than the events it describes. And we'll get into why that's important here in a second. But one of the reasons we know for sure that this is written much later is because of this phrase in Judges chapter 18, verse 31, where it's going to say, and his sons were priests of the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land, Ad Yom Gelot Haaretz. So the question is, okay, what is the day of the captivity of the land? What is it referring to? And so this is more than likely, especially given the ad yod, the until the day, and the galot, meaning the captivity or the exile is another way to translate that, is probably referring to 2 Kings 17:32, which is the same thing that happened there to at least the southern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and not the kingdom of Judah that would have been up in the north after the division of the kingdom. And so similarly, you're going to have a similar phrase. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day, where you have the Ad Hayom Hazeh until this day. And then you have that term exile, the Galot, and the Veyagel, and both from Galal, which means to exile and whatnot. So even though the word Assyrian is not used there, Assyria, in Hebrew, you can infer that this is probably what it's referring to. So this was not written until after the southern kingdom of Israel had fallen, and that the Danites had been sent out into captivity, or everything in the land had been placed under captivity, at least in the southern part of Israel. All right, so and the reason I'd want to emphasize that is because of the cycle that's here. So remember, this cycle has 6 elements to it, and this is given to us in Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 19. Israel is going to reject the Lord. God's going to respond with wrath. A judge is going to be raised up, and the people are going to be saved because of their groaning. The judge is then going to die, and then the people are going to continue to reject the Lord. Now, the only way that you would know for sure to select these 12 judges and to make sure that you emphasized these 6 elements as best as you were able to from the historical documents and whatnot, is if the events had already happened. So let's take, for example, if we were talking about periods in the history of America, and I said, I'm going to write an account of things that happened from this president to another president. Say I was going to cover 12 presidents, just like here in the book of Judges. If I wanted to point out 6 common elements of those 12 presidents, I can't be writing while those 12 presidents are still alive. Maybe while the last one's alive, but I can't be doing it while all 12 of them are alive, or even before one of them became president. So I'd have to be able to look at all of that. I'd have to be able to gather documents about them, and then I'd have to look through all of those to say, okay, let's match up 6 things that I think are interesting or I want to point out about their presidencies. So similarly here, you can assume that these judges have come and gone. Since they have already, passed away and their times have gone on, that now someone is coming back and trying to put together what has happened, and then they're giving you a count that roughly these 6 things have a commonality in the cycle of the judges. And once again, this is part of the reason why it's evident to see the book of Judges as cyclical, because that's already put into the design of the book by the authorial intention, by the final editor of the book anyways. So once again, you've got this cycle in Judges where Israel serves the Lord, Israel then falls into sin, Israel then becomes enslaved, the people cry out to the Lord, God raises up a judge, and Israel is delivered. And then once again, that cycle would continue over and over again. So, and I should probably say it this way as well, potentially historically there were more than just 12 judges. So I want to make sure that that's clear. There's that possibility. There could have been 25 different judges. There could have been 1,000 different judges during this period. We only know about 12 of them. And the reason that's important is because Othniel is chosen as the first judge, potentially because he's the first one historically, but also because he fits this pattern, and this pattern is going to change as we go throughout. So once again, you should be looking for these 6 elements, but there is variation that happens amongst them throughout the book of Judges. So if you start with Othniel, you're going to have all 6 here. The people reject the Lord. God sends his wrath, that they are under the king of Mesopotamia, Cushan, for 8 years. The people then cry out. Othniel is going to be raised up to deliver them. He's Caleb's brother, so he's from the tribe of Judah, or at least associated with the tribe of Judah. The people then are saved, and then Othniel dies. And then the same thing happens again. They're going to reject the Lord and whatnot. So you get all 6 elements here with actual detailed descriptions that were given to you earlier in the book of Judges. Now we're going to look at Gideon, since we're going to talk about Gideon's anyway. So once again, notice here we do have Gideons, and we have all 6 elements, but then a 5th one is, we have all 6 elements, and then a 7th one is added. So once again, the people reject the Lord. God sends his wrath. Midian rises up and becomes their enemy. We don't have a specific king that's mentioned here, not by name. The people cry out, and then we have this new element here that God sends a prophet. And this prophet gives them a reminder that, hey, this cycle has happened, and we need to, in a sense, not be a part of this cycle. He reminds them of what God said in Judges chapter 2, verses 16 through 23. And then Gideon gets raised up as a judge. And Gideon goes on this decline, as you would have read in Evan's section here on her analysis of Judges, that Gideon goes from being faithful to mediocre to a tyrant, in her opinion. And so then the people do get saved, but even though they get saved, Gideon pretty much does not do his best job as a leader, which we're going to talk about here in a second, and then he dies. So one of the things that you need to be able to see is that as the cycle progresses throughout the book of Judges, in a sense, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, or variates and variates and variates and variates, and it does not fit that same sort of pattern until you get to the point where it's just mostly about the people rejecting God. And so, in fact, and forgive me, I said Cheryl Evans earlier, it's Cheryl Brown. I'll just correct that now. But in fact, Cheryl Brown is even going to point out that it's not by accident that this is the last time in Gideon's narrative, when Gideon brings about the peace for Israel, that the book of Judges refers to the land having peace. So after this point on, the land itself is no longer at peace, which means that the people are not at peace as well. Now it's talking about the land, but when it's almost like saying when you go to a neighborhood where there's trash everywhere and things are bad, and I mean, we refer to those as ghettos and things like that here in America. You can expect that neighborhood to also have a lot of crime and a lot of other things going on compared to when you go to a neighborhood where everything is clean and in order and quote unquote the land is at peace. Then the people tend to be at peace as well. The way we treat our environment has a lot to do with the way that we are going to treat each other and how we actually engage with each other. So similarly, this is the last time where the environment seems to be at peace. And then from here, because the environment is not, neither are the people. And once again, I should have mentioned that technically Gideon is the fifth judge. Just looking at that here, so forgive me. So let's look at all of these examples here. So you have in Judges chapter 3, verse 11, that the land had rest with the first judge, Othniel. And then the second judge, Ehud, same thing, had rest for 80 years, double the amount of time that Othniel's was. So you could see and potentially think that things are getting better. But then you get to Deborah, and it goes back to 40 years of rest. And then you have the last time it's stated with Gideon being that it had 40 years of rest again. And the point here being is after this point on, there is no more rest for the land. And this is also the first time that Gideon brings into this sort of false worship. As one who should have been leading the people away from false worship, he becomes kind of the arbiter of false worship. So now we're going to narrow in on Gideon's call as a king here. So in Judges chapter 8, we read the following in verses 22 and 23. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son, and your grandson also. For you have saved us," which is an important phrase we're going to look at here in a second, "from the hands of Midian." And then Gideon rightfully says to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." So this seems to be a good pious, good statement, or at least a statement of correct faith to say like God is your ruler. But then Gideon does something weird in a minute, but we'll focus on the rest of this first. And so Gideon is in a sense saying, and potentially this psalm even existed, that the people come to him and say, Ki Hosha Tanu, meaning, hey, you have saved us. You saved us. But this is something they should have been saying about God himself. So if you read in Psalm 44, verses 4 through 8, "You're my king, O God, ordain salvation for Jacob. Though through you we have pushed down our foes. Through your name we have treaded down those who rise up against us. For not in my bow do I trust, nor with my sword, nor can my sword save me." So Gideon, the warrior, right there. "But you have saved us. Ki Hosha Tanu, you have saved us from our enemies and have put to shame those who hate us. In God we have boasted continuously, and we will continue to give thanks, and we will give thanks to your name forever." Shelah. And so the point being is here, that's the creed that Israel should have been making. That's the creed that Gideon makes. But things take a turn for the bad, for the worst here in just a few verses later. So even though Gideon tells them God is your king, Gideon still gives them something. And what he ends up giving them is he tells them to give all of their earrings of gold, and he makes for them an ephod. And an ephod would have been the priest cloak that would normally be worn for proper worship. Aaron would be the first one to wear it, and then his sons after him. So it should have been something worn by the high priest and the priests themselves to guide Israel into proper worship. So instead, he takes this and he puts it in his own city in Ophrah. Not for all of Israel, but just in his own city. And Israel whores after it, meaning that they go there and worship after it. And it becomes a snare to Gideon and to his family. So the point here being is that snare is what they were trying to avoid. So once again, in Judges 2:3, the reason God says, "I'm not going to drive them out before you," but they're going to become thorns in your side, and their gods will be a snare to you. But Gideon himself, in a sense, becomes this god. So instead of viewing Gideon as something separate from these gods, Gideon ends up creating a reason for them to worship other gods. In a sense, Gideon ends up creating a god if that sort of god didn't exist, or a reason for them to associate the ephod or this priestly garment that he has made and he puts in his city with some sort of other god for Israel to whore after. So this does not help Gideon, and this only helps for something to become a snare in his side, just like God had promised was going to be a snare to Israel from the very beginning. And so one of the morals we need to take from Gideon's is, one, to be faithful throughout everything that God has called us to do. And two, don't let our words not match our actions. So Gideon's words were very clear, but his actions actually led to something else. And even if he had a good intention for giving in to sometimes giving in to a little bit of something bad is just as bad as giving in to all of it. So we'll end with making some comments on Samson's leadership. So once again, Samson is the 12th and final judge, and he was pretty much a lackluster judge. So he was constantly going with prostitutes, constantly not really trying to lead in any other capacity other than fighting the Philistines when they would kind of bother him in his own situation. And so he finally gets to the end of dealing with Delilah, and this being the fourth time that she has requested that she could figure out where his strength comes from, and he tells her the truth. And so after telling her the truth, the Philistines come upon him, and he wakes up and he loses his strength because he does not know that the Lord had left him. Now, Cheryl Brown does a good job of pointing out that the word there that he explains to Delilah over and over again is that he's going to become like any other man. And becoming like any other man, as you'll find here in the book, is him becoming like common. It's him becoming unsacred, unset apart. So God had set him apart, yeah, and I'll read her words here. There was nothing magical about his hair. Its power lay in what it represented, his special relationship to the Lord, that he was not like every other man, but set apart to the Lord, distinct and different. With the cutting of his hair, he lost that special distinction and relationship. He became like everyone else. Perhaps the greatest tragedy with Samson is that he disdained that special relationship. The Lord had awesome plans for his life and for Israel through him. And then she cites chapter 13, verse 6. So the point here is we have all been set apart for God in some capacity to do something in this life. And the reality is we'll do that whether we live holy or not. Not in a sense that we are robots, but in a sense that that becomes our passion, our drive, what we want to do as people. So, I was put here, as far as I can tell, to be teaching Old Testament and to do some Old Testament scholarship, to finish my commentary on Jeremiah, and to work on some other writing projects. And I was also put here to be a math teacher like I was before I started doing this, and also put here to have the children that I've had. All of these are passions that I want to have, and potentially I was going to do that whether I was living for the Lord or not. But living for the Lord is going to make it easier and going to make it more in tune with who I am, instead of me rejecting God and looking for something in spite of this. There are people who do biblical scholarship who are non-Christians and do good scholarship, but they just miss the glory of it. They miss the point of what it's supposed to be about. So similarly, Samson potentially missed the point of a lot of what God wanted him to do in life. So even though the Spirit of the Lord had been stirring upon him in Mahane Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol, and even though he was told from the very beginning, his mom, that he should be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he would be the one who would at least begin the process of saving Israel from the hands of the Philistines, he chose his own desires, which led to his own downfall. Now we know the story, that his hair is going to grow back and that he is going to be able to defeat the Philistines, especially those who would gawk at him while he was, in a sense, on trial and whatnot, before the Philistines were going to be, just there for their entertainment. He does get the last say. But I think we should question whether or not us being in Christian leadership should be that difficult. We should be more in tune with God, that we would not have to struggle with sin doing that. So we have the righteousness of God that can help us avoid sinfulness, but we also need to keep in mind that when we have a sense of calling or purpose upon us, there's a certain sense where we are going to live out that purpose, even if we live very shallowly. But the question is why? Why live shallow? Why not live better because of our calling and in tune that with God and righteousness and fruits of the Spirit and not void of any sense of commonality? Why make more thorns and snares in our life than are necessary? So, once again, I hope you have a good Thanksgiving this week and God bless. I hope you do well on the quiz and on the assignments.